Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about the good life and hedonism. Alright, so once again, here's our old friend psychological egoism. Every human action is ultimately motivated by self-interest, or another way to put this is a concern for one's own welfare or well-being for its own sake. Now you'll notice that here there are some terms that aren't really defined at all. Self-interest, welfare, well-being. What do these things mean? What is in my self-interest anyway? What makes my life go better rather than worse? What makes your life go better rather than worse? This is just a human question. What makes a human life good or bad? Sometimes we might put this in terms of what makes a life happy. It's important though to note that the word happiness in English, I think we tend to hear that as a experience, like the experience of joy. And while that may be a part of the happy life or the good life, it's important that we don't prejudge that the good life is entirely an experiential matter, because that's part of what hedonism is going to assert, and we'll see through the experience machine is controversial. So it's better to put the question as what is in my welfare? What constitutes the well-being of a human, or what makes a human life go well? So this is a more general topic of what is the good life. Let's say that a theory of well-being or a theory of the good life is just a general philosophical account about what makes a human life good, well-lived, or worth living. And usually there will be a corollary about what makes a life worse, or what makes a life bad. Perhaps there's just one important factor in the good life: the satisfaction of your basic desires, or for hedonism, pleasure. But as we'll see next week with Aristotle and Mencius, there may be many factors that make a life go better. Perhaps pleasure has a role, but there are other intrinsic goods as well. So I just use this term, intrinsic goods. What do I mean by that? Let's draw a distinction here between intrinsic goods on the one hand and extrinsic goods on the other. So this roughly corresponds to Socrates' distinction between things that are choice-worthy, or things that are desirable for the sake of other things, and then things that are desirable in and of themselves. I'm sort of switching up the terminology a little bit to couch it in terms of value or goodness, but you could see them as roughly interchangeable. Desirability, value, goodness is what we're interested in here. So some things, according to this distinction, are extrinsically good or valuable. That is to say, their value or goodness is inherited from the value or goodness of something else. What does that mean? Well, it means that something can genuinely be good, and indeed good for a human, but only in virtue of the fact that it gets us something else that's good. The paradigm example is, just as with the Socratic distinction, is money. The only reason we want money is to get things, and usually the things we get with money are themselves mere means to an end of something else that has, we hope, intrinsic value. And of course, that's not to say that money has no value. It does. It's just to say that its value is inherited or extrinsic. It's borrowed from the value of the things that money can buy. Intrinsic value or goodness. I don't want to prejudice the idea that there is such a thing, because as we'll see with Aristotle, there's room to say perhaps nothing is intrinsically good. But the idea of an intrinsic good is the idea of something that has value or goodness in a way that's independent of the goodness or value of anything else. So if money couldn't buy you anything, money would have no value. But if there's an intrinsic good, it wouldn't matter what else it could get you. An intrinsic good would be good regardless of what you could, so to speak, purchase with it. It has value in its own right. Some candidates for intrinsic goods. These are all controversial, and really the basis of philosophical theories of value and the good life. and ethics for that matter. Pleasure is a candidate for something that has intrinsic value. Sometimes we just want pleasure for its own sake. You don't have to be a hedonist to think that. Again, Aristotle, as we'll see, thinks that sometimes we want pleasure for its own sake, but that's not the only thing we want for its own sake. Knowledge. It could be that sometimes it's just a good thing for a human to know the world. It just makes one's life go better to have a grasp of the reality in which one lives. Or even perhaps to know oneself. You might think that self-knowledge is a kind of intrinsic good. That even if you learn of yourself some bad piece of information that makes you feel, sad or depressed or down on yourself, that nevertheless, knowing that fact about yourself is a good thing unto itself. Something like achievement, maybe, in certain domains, maybe athletic achievement, athletic excellence, perhaps aesthetic achievement, a beautiful work of art, that might be something that has intrinsic value. Again, these are all controversial. And then finally, virtue, like moral virtue, right? You might think that being a courageous person or being a generous person, having that disposition, that quality, that character trait, is good in its own right, even if, say, it gets you nothing. Even if, for example, you live in a society that does not reward generosity, but punishes the generous. You might think that that's too bad, and it would be nice if society rewarded generosity, but that nevertheless, generosity and other virtues are intrinsic goods and worth having, despite what other goods they might or might not get you. Okay, so that's the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic goods. This gives us a nice framework within which to define hedonism. So here's the hedonic theory of value. The hedonic theory of value tells us what the units of intrinsic goodness are. According to hedonism, pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Everything else, according to hedonism, either has no value, or if it does have value, its value is entirely derivative. The value of money is ultimately explained by the fact that money can bring you pleasure by way of a feeling of security by storing it up, or the pleasures you can get by buying things with money. Those are the things that have value and what make money worth having. Even something like virtue, according to the hedonist, the reason that we should cultivate, to the extent that we should, courage, generosity, and other moral virtues, the reason those things are worth having and good for you is because it's pleasant to be a moral person. Pleasant for you. It's pleasing. You feel satisfied with yourself. The value of virtue is not intrinsic. If for some reason virtue were painful in some alternative setup where mad scientists hardwired your brain to feel pain whenever you were generous, just excruciating pain, the hedonist would say then virtue would have no value, because its value is entirely derivative upon the pleasure that it brings about. By contrast, according to the hedonic theory of value, pain is the only intrinsic evil or bad. There are other bad things, but everything else that's bad, according to the hedonists, is merely extrinsically bad. The badness of those things is inherited from the badness of pain that they bring about. That's the hedonic theory of value. So you can think of hedonism as the conjunction of the hedonic theory of value with their theory of well-being. And the theory of well-being or welfare takes the theory of value and fleshes out what a life, what the good life is like for a human being in terms of that theory of value. So according to hedonism, the good life for a human being, the life of maximal net pleasure. It's the pleasant life is the good life. What is net pleasure? This came up in class, and so we should be careful not to just conflate uh, uh, conflate the idea of a life of maximal net pleasure on the one hand with the idea of, say, maximal pleasure in a particular moment of one's life. Net pleasure you can think of as total pleasure experienced in a life minus total pain. So here's a person's lifespan. Okay. Sorry about that. Here's a person's lifespan, and this is obviously a silly oversimplification, but here they experience a bit of pleasure toward the beginning of their life, plus one unit of pleasure, a bit more pleasure a couple years later, another plus one, but then maybe adolescence, they go through a period of pain, minus one. Early adulthood, I don't know, they get married, settle down, have a fulfilling career, they get another plus one of pleasure. But then they have a midlife crisis, minus one of pain. And then they resolve their midlife crisis, say, in a way that gives them meaning. And their retirement is enjoyable, plus one of pleasure. And then, unfortunately, they die a painful death, minus one of pain. So if you're looking at this and you're a hedonist, you're going to need to do a calculation of what is the net pleasure of this person's life. Well, it's the total amount of pleasure. So you count up the sort of pleasure points that they experience, 1, 2, 3, 4, minus the total amount of pain, 1, 2, 3. So this person has a net of plus one net pleasure throughout their life. Now, this is a huge oversimplification. I mean, among other things, I'm just assigning silly plus one, minus one numbers to units of pain. Can pain and pleasure be quantified in this way? I don't know. Many hedonists think it can. Not in this simplistic way, but in some way. We can assign quantities and compare amounts of pleasure and pain. At the very least, though, we can make intuitive judgments about, say, a life that is very short, that is filled with, say, something terrible, some painful disease in early childhood, and then the life is cut short by a brutal death in early adolescence. Like, the net amount of pleasure in that life is quite low compared to, say, the life of somebody who lives in wealth and luxury and also moral fulfillment somehow, if those are compatible, and has a great career and learns everything there is to know about the universe and then dies peacefully, right? Like, that person's life intuitively, I don't know how to assign the numbers, a lot more net pleasure. The hedonist says the good life is the life of maximal net pleasure. That's like the perfect, ideal life. The more net pleasure a life has, the better that life is.